Hey folks, it's Patriot Nurse. Thank you for joining me today. In this video, we're going to discuss the situation in Ukraine and its implications for us as people who are focused towards preparedness. So a few weeks ago, I released a video entitled "Is Our Bubble About to Burst?" talking about this situation that's happening right now in Ukraine and what the implications are for the bigger picture. So my assessment really hasn't changed that much because I thought that Putin was going to move to invade Ukraine, and that happened. And there are many things that have played out since then. But the first thing that I want to cover is that this is not an accident, and there was a very definitive statement that was made based on the timing of the invasion. I've not heard anybody mention this yet. The long telegram, which was a departmental memo released by George Kennan after World War II, was released on February 22nd, 1946. Interesting date, coinciding with the time in which Putin chose to invade Ukraine. The long telegram served as the American basis for foreign policy of Soviet containment after World War II and the victory of the Allies over the Axis, when it was determined that the Soviet threat of communism was not going to stop and to cease after World War II, but instead the conclusion of World War II had hastened in a whole new era of conflict, soft conflict. The United States' position internationally was one of de facto empire subsidized by our dollar and by the indebtedness that the Marshall Plan fostered with rebuilding Europe, indebted to us, the United States, on dollars that were lent out to them. So Putin's decision to invade Ukraine on the anniversary of this memo being released is basically a large FU to the rest of the world, and in particular to NATO powers, NATO allied powers, and also to the United States in general as part of our foreign policy after World War II. Our hegemonic status has been relatively unchanged throughout that time. Now, granted, throughout the Cold War and through the proxy conflicts that we engaged in with Russia, whether it was the Bay of Pigs or Afghanistan, whatever the case may be, we have had an uneasy peace and a tension with now Russia, but the Soviet Union prior to its fall, its official fall. Putin, however, is a man who is very much a product of his time, his circumstances, his influences, and Soviet dogma. As part of the secret police, he would not have gotten into a position of power if he had not been sold out to the party. And party doctrine and dogma within the communist element doesn't go away simply because there's been a change of leadership. Rather, it is a change in the clothes on the doll, so to speak, but the doll is still the same. And as someone who has a background in studying in the interactions between peoples in history, when you look at the history of the Russian peoples and of the Slavic peoples in particular, this area of Ukraine, this area of Eastern Europe, this border with Russia has always been in a tension between the West, Western Europe, and Russia. It has always served as a buffer zone, and for that reason it has known conflict throughout the years. How does this play into our perspective here in the West as focusing on preparedness? First off, Ukraine is now and has been for a very long time the agricultural hub of Eastern Europe. It is a major purveyor of agricultural commodities internationally, including wheat, but also beans. And so whenever there's disruptions in the normal goings about of day-to-day economic interactions, that's going to have a larger ripple effect to global impact in the economies of different nations. And so we are not immune to this. When you combine this with the fact that Western powers now and NATO powers are starting to reevaluate their lackadaisicalness in light of Russia taking territory, this is going to bring about a series of events that is a reshuffling of power. Because if you paid attention to the videos that I've released over the past several years, you know that there are three ubiquitous catalysts for major change throughout history, and they are war, famine, and disease. The previous 2 years of impacts from the pandemic have destabilized power structures that had been previously well ensconced. They have disrupted supply lines, and as a result of that, put more pressure on trade internationally, which is the bedrock of good relations between countries and neighbors, is trade. When you have this destabilization combined with an aging and waning empire status of the United States, built on our World War II victory and getting the world hooked on the dollar, getting the world addicted to the dollar, because we have an aging power status, we have been ripe for conflict and to have other aspiring hegemons challenge us, whether it's China or whether it's Russia. This was bound to happen. The question is now, where do we stand in history and where do we sit on this shuffling? In my opinion, we are sitting, and I have said this for over 2 years now, we are sitting at a junction point that looks very similar to me to the beginning of World War I, because you have these alliances and these entanglements and these treaties that have people groups enmeshed that had previously had common enemies and common rally points. But now, because of changing dynamics and the role of human progress and the role of technology, definitely the change in technology, these alliances are being tested again in a new world that makes the former one in which they were formed pale in comparison. So what we're going to see, I think, is an increase in isolation in Russia, and there is a certain paranoia that exists within the psyche, particularly the Soviet psyche, one of internal purges that was evidenced and has been evidenced throughout the totality of communism's rise to power, whether it was with Lenin purging the interior, or definitely with Stalin, and move all the way up into the present with Putin murdering people, and particularly poisoning with, was it polonium-210, poisoning journalists who would take positions against him. This is part of the MO of the Soviet mind. The Soviet mind is one of paranoia, one in which Russia is pitted against the rest of the world, and they have certain good reasons from their own history to believe things as such. But because of their de facto oppositional, there is no mutual benefit. There is always a winner and a loser in an interaction. There's never a win-win in an interaction. Because this is their standard MO, this puts them at a very different position for objectives and for war aims than what we would view in the West. So they have every incentive not to comply. They have every incentive not to cooperate. They have every incentive to double down and to persist in the original plan of action. When you couple together this isolation with Russia, as well as the isolation that China has brought about itself, definitely with its leaders increasingly pursuing more hardliner policies, more hardliner communist policies, suppression of democratic processes in Hong Kong that had been happening prior to Wuhan, the issues going on in Wuhan. We are setting up for a complete reshuffling and realigning of power, one in which I think that Russia will continue to do what it's going to do. This will give incentive to the Chinese to take Taiwan. When this happens, there will be an increase in tensions in the Pacific. The Marine Corps has already been retooled towards engagements in the Pacific for a couple of years now. This is not coming as a surprise to the war machine of the United States. And so I anticipate that whenever this nexus gets to a boiling point, that we will end up having to involve ourselves in the Pacific in order to secure supply lines and to keep shipping lanes open and going. Because again, the bedrock of good relations between nations is free and open trade. And if that doesn't happen because one empire, one rising, aspiring second-tier hegemon is getting a great idea from the main challenger hegemon for us over the past 50, 60 years, this is going to set off probably a cascade of effects. And this will invariably strain our position internationally as a leader in the United States. When you combine that with the domestic issues that we're facing, with an executive branch that has been ruled and operated by people who do not value the Constitution and by people who certainly do not value separation of powers, this is leading, I would say, inexorably, barring a major move of the Creator, to a waning of United States power And as the United States wanes, there will be an increase in tensions domestically here, not only between states, but between states and this federal government, which now has lost all veneer of legitimacy. When you consider the role of our federal government, which is to secure our borders and to protect us internationally and to make treaties, etc., if it has not secured our borders, which it clearly hasn't with Mexico, and it has oppressed the people's rights instead of upholding their rights, and it has overstepped its bounds, in particular relating to the 10th Amendment over the past 2 years. Now, if it's not able to make good on its promises and to keep us going as a power, it no longer has any legitimacy from without and from within. So I believe that over the next several months, edging into the next few years, we are going to see drastic change. And it behooves us to be prepared and to decrease our dependence upon the grid, to decrease our dependence upon anything associated with the federal government, for they have shown that they are utterly and ultimately untrustworthy. I think that you can do this in various different ways. Some people, the answer is going to be to start homesteading and to move off grid, to move to various different places that are less populated. That will not be the answer for everyone. And so rather than advocate that you follow some cookie cutter metric of what other people are doing or what survival fantasy books would have you believe is the only answer, I would recommend that you get quiet and you pray and you determine what is going to be the best course of action for you, for where you're at. But one thing I can assure you is that if you have the 3 bases covered, beans, bullets, and band-aids, you're in a much better position to weather changes from within or from without. And that people historically who are forward-thinking, they tend to value these things and be way ahead of the power curve before it shifts. So let me encourage you to focus on building up your provisions, to have at least a month's worth of food stored up. And once you get to a month, move to 3, from 3 to 6, from 6 to a year. Once you get to this place to be able to meet your basic needs of food, shelter, and clothing for more than a month at a time, you're going to be in a much better situation where you don't have to get emotional and panic when the rest of the world is shifting drastically. From the bullet standpoint, it is always a good idea to be able to defend yourself. How much more so when we consider Ukraine as an example? Our founding fathers wrote into the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This includes protecting yourself and your family from violent criminals, whether with badges or without badges. But in the most recent example of Ukraine, the citizenry has to be mobilized in order to defend itself against foreign invaders. There is no standing army in the world large enough to repel another army that's of superior might and capability. The people are the ones who must take upon themselves the burden of their own defense. And we're seeing this in Ukraine right now, that the idea of the militia works. The next thing that we should consider is the Band-Aids portion. And whether it is because healthcare in the United States is becoming increasingly unaffordable for many people, or it's becoming inaccessible because of various statuses, whether or not you chose to roll up your sleeve or you have objections to such, it is becoming less and less available for people, and also becoming increasingly politically weaponized against people based on their choices. And they're having healthcare services denied them because of their personal choices, deeply and sincerely held faith-based convictions. It will help you, wherever you are, to have a better position of power if you can meet your family's healthcare needs at home without having to rely upon anyone else. And I recommend that you pursue training and that you also store up your medical supplies. If you would like to train with me, you have lots of different options. You can train online. You can train with me in person. My next class is in Columbus, Ohio, and then I'm going to Jacksonville, Florida, going to Kalispell, Montana, also Texas this year, probably Milwaukee, Idaho Falls is looking likely, Charlotte, North Carolina. There's lots of different places that you can train with me. So check that full schedule out at the website, thepatriotnurse.com. Friends, the 3 ubiquitous circumstances that are the catalysts for change throughout history are war, famine, and disease. If you understand human history and you are a student of human history, then you need precious little else in order to do well in this world and to make wise decisions. So I recommend that you take the opportunity now to take a breath and to evaluate your provisions, to evaluate wise courses of action for you and your family, and to determine appropriately through prayer and through wise counsel what the next best steps are going to be for you to take care of your family in the days to come. I hope it was helpful for y'all. I hope you have a very blessed week. For now, it's Patriot Nurse signing off, and I'll see y'all later.